They say a person's life can be measured in the things they leave behind, but standing here in front of this cracked mirror in the old farmhouse loft, I measure mine in calluses. At 58 years old, my hands tell the true story of who I am. Look closely at these fingers, knotted, swollen at the joints, permanently stained with the rich, dark soil of Nebraska. This is what 15 years of brutal winters, endless summers, and relentless dawn-to-dusk labor look like. 15 years ago, my husband passed away in his sleep, leaving me alone with an 8-year-old boy named Thaddeus and 5,000 acres of mortgaged, neglected farmland in the valley. People in town said a woman alone could never hold on to a place this vast. They whispered that I would lose the land within 2 winters, that I should pack my bags and move into a small rental in the city. But I didn't listen. I stayed. I woke up every morning at 4 o'clock, wrapped my aching joints in warm flannel, and climbed onto the tractor. I plowed the fields, negotiated seed prices, and scraped together every single penny so that Thaddeus could escape the mud, go to the finest universities in the country, and build a life free from the back-breaking labor that consumed my youth. Today, Thaddeus is the executive vice president of a prominent investment fund. He sends money every month, but I never touch a dime of it. I live off what the soil gives me, and tonight, that soil is coming with me. I didn't dress up for what is about to happen. I pulled on my old wool coat, the one with the frayed elbows that has kept me warm for 10 years. I stepped into my heavy cowhide work boots, leaving them intentionally thick with a crust of dry, gray mud straight from this morning's potato harvest. My jeans are worn at the knees, faded from years of friction against denim and tractor seats. Some might call it a stunt, a deliberate performance to make a point, but it isn't. I am simply wearing the honest truth of who I am. I want to see how the world treats a mother when she looks exactly like what she is, an aging farmer who smells faintly of earth and hard work. I climbed into the driver's seat of my battered, smoke-gray Ford F-150. The odometer clicked past 250,000 miles somewhere around the state line. Every dent on this truck has a memory attached to it. A fence post I misjudged in the freezing rain, a rock I clipped during the Great Drought of 14. I drove 4 hours straight through the interstate, watching the sprawling fields slowly give way to concrete, steel, and the glittering towers of downtown Chicago. My destination was the Azure. If you have ever lived anywhere near downtown Chicago, you know the name. The Azure is not just a restaurant, it is a monument to excessive wealth, a place where business moguls close multi-million-dollar deals over plates of imported caviar, and where ordinary working people are filtered out long before they ever reach the velvet-roped entrance. The glass doors gleamed under custom crystal chandeliers, reflecting the pristine uniforms of the valets and the flawless silk gowns of the clientele. I pulled my rusty pickup right up to the grand entrance, steering past a row of gleaming European sports cars and luxury sedans. The engine rattled, coughing out a faint puff of exhaust before I cut the ignition. For a moment, the heavy silence inside the cab contrasted sharply with the vibrant hum of the city street outside. The head valet parking attendant, a young man in a sharply pressed charcoal suit with gold-plated buttons, turned his head toward the sound of my rattling engine. His eyes swept over the mud-caked tires of my truck, drifted up to the scratched bumper, and finally landed on me through the rolled-down window. I could see the exact calculation happening behind his eyes, the quiet panic of a high-end employee spotting an obvious mistake, someone who had clearly taken a wrong turn off the highway and wandered into the wrong tax bracket. He stepped forward, his expression tightening into a polite, practiced mask designed to handle trespassers without making a scene. He placed his gloved hand on the edge of my truck door, clearing his throat with a carefully measured tone of corporate hospitality. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and guarded. "I think you might be looking for the delivery loading dock around the back on Jackson Street. The main entrance is reserved for our evening guests." He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't insult me outright. He didn't have to. The quiet condescension in his eyes said everything words couldn't. He looked at my mud-stained boots resting on the rubber floor mat, and he looked at my worn coat. To him, someone who looked like me didn't belong anywhere near the front of the building unless we were hauling crates of produce through the back kitchen doors. I didn't argue with him. I didn't raise my voice or try to explain. In a world obsessed with surface appearances, arguing with a valet is a waste of breath. Instead, I reached into the deep pocket of my faded wool coat, pulled out a heavy cream-colored cardstock envelope embossed with gold lettering, and handed it directly to him. The attendant took it, assuming it was perhaps a coupon or a misplaced receipt, but the moment his eyes scanned the name printed across the front, VIP Private Dining Room Reserved by Thaddeus Vance, the polite smile froze entirely on his face. He stared at the name, then looked back up at my mud-caked boots, his fingers tightening nervously around the heavy paper. He swallowed hard, the corporate polish instantly draining from his posture. He opened his mouth, pulled back the heavy glass door, and gestured toward the gleaming foyer with a bow that was suddenly far more deep than it had been a moment ago. I killed the engine, pushed open the heavy door of my truck, and stepped out onto the polished marble of downtown Chicago. My boots clicked against the stone, leaving faint, dry flecks of Nebraska soil on the pristine floor. I walked through the double glass doors of the grand lobby, and the sudden rush of warm air hit my face, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and roasted rosemary. The interior of the Azor was a world away from the dusty expanse of my valley. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from the high ceiling, casting brilliant reflections over polished marble floors and white-clothed tables where men in bespoke suits and women in silk gowns murmured over silver cutlery. I paused just past the entrance, letting my eyes adjust to the soft golden illumination. It didn't take long to find him. Thaddeus was standing near the reception desk, scanning the crowd with an expression of quiet anticipation. His moment his eyes locked onto me, standing there in my worn-out wool coat and mud-caked boots, his face lit up. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He walked straight across the gleaming floor, ignoring the startled glances of the surrounding patrons, and wrapped his arms around me. His embrace was strong and warm, smelling of cedarwood and the clean scent of city life. He buried his face slightly against my shoulder, holding me close with all the deep, unreserved respect he had carried in his heart since he was a little boy. For a fleeting moment, the weight of the last 15 years, the cold dawns, the aching joints, the endless loneliness, seemed to lift from my shoulders. But that warmth was painfully short-lived. Standing right beside him, frozen like a statue caught in the middle of a nightmare, was Guinevere Thorne. She was a vision of high society perfection, draped in haute couture evening gown of midnight black silk that hugged her slender frame. Diamond teardrop earrings caught the light of the crystal chandelier every time she breathed, and her hair was styled in an effortless, immaculate cascade over her shoulders. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Then, her gaze dropped. Her eyes swept slowly down from my silver-streaked hair, past my faded shoulders, all the way down to the thick, dry crust of Nebraska's soil clinging to the sides of my work boots. The polite, rehearsed smile she had worn for the restaurant vanished instantly, wiped clean by a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust, the kind you give a stray animal that had wandered onto a pristine white carpet. Without saying a word to me, Guinevere grabbed Thaddeus tightly by the sleeve of his expensive Italian wool suit. With a sharp, commanding jerk, she dragged him away from me, retreating barely 10 feet into the shadowed alcove beside a towering marble pillar. I stood completely still on the marble floor. My weathered hands, scarred from decades of pulling barbed wire and gripping tractor steering wheels, tightened slowly into fists inside my coat pockets. Though they tried to lower their voices, the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling and the short distance between us carried every sharp syllable straight to my ears. Guinevere's voice cut through the ambient murmur of the restaurant like a razor blade. "Thaddeus, are you out of your mind?" she hissed, her face contorted with fury as she glared back at me. "I am not sitting next to her. Look at her. She looks like she just crawled out of a livestock barn. She smells like fertilizer and dirt. My parents' friends, the Elringtons and the Harrisons, are arriving any minute now. What on earth do you expect me to tell them? Do you want everyone in our circle to think your family consists of filthy, uneducated peasants?" Thaddeus didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout, and he didn't stumble over his words. His face went entirely blank, his eyes darkening into a shade of cold, unreadable resolve. He looked down at the fingers of her manicured hand clutching his sleeve, then raised his gaze to meet hers directly.
"She is my mother," Thaddeus said, his voice flat, steady, and terrifyingly calm. Guinevere let out a sharp, breathless laugh of disbelief, tightening her grip on her designer handbag until her knuckles turned white. Every pretense of patience she might have possessed was entirely gone. "I know she's your mother," Guinevere snapped back, her voice rising in frantic desperation. "I know she's your mother, but we are getting married in 3 months. We are building a life in the upper echelons of this city, Thaddeus. I have worked for years to curate our image, and you're just going to let this old farm woman ruin everything because of some misplaced sentimentality? Either she leaves right now, or I walk out of this restaurant and our engagement is over." She stood there breathing heavily, chest rising and falling beneath her silk gown, utterly convinced that she held all the cards. She believed that the fear of losing her, her family name, and her social standing would force my son to fold, to sweep his own mother under the rug like an embarrassing piece of trash. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and more importantly, she had no idea that my son had already stopped playing her game. Thaddeus slowly slid his hand away from her grasp. He didn't argue, he didn't plead, and he didn't try to reason with her poisoned logic. Instead, his hand drifted down to the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored cardstock envelope, its surface completely unblemished. With deliberate, agonizing slowness, he walked past her, crossed the few feet of open space to the private dining table covered in its spotless, starched white tablecloth, and placed the envelope right in the center. He looked up, staring straight into Guinevere's bewildered eyes as she followed him back to the table. "All right," Thaddeus said, his voice carrying a quiet finality that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. At a quiet gesture from Guinevere, the head waiter hurried over, murmuring quick, practiced apologies before hastily rearranging our seating plan. With a polite, manufactured smile that didn't reach his eyes, he guided me away from the vibrant center of the room, pushing me as far from the crystal chandeliers and white linens as the restaurant's architectural layout would allow. They tucked me away into the darkest, most isolated corner of the entire dining room, directly beside the heavy, swinging double doors of the kitchen. It was a constant parade of raw, unfiltered chaos. Every few seconds, the doors flew open, letting out a sharp blast of humid air, heavy with the stinging scent of commercial dish soap,
food waste and stale grease, accompanied by the metallic clatter of dropped silverware, the shouting of kitchen orders, and the endless hurried footsteps of passing busboys and waiters. Thaddeus immediately dropped his linen napkin, pushing his heavy wooden chair back with a sharp scrape to follow me across the room, but I stopped him with the single, quiet motion of my hand, shaking my head just enough to keep him anchored firmly at the main table. There was no need for him to make a spectacle just yet. I walked over to the small, unadorned table, resting right beside the kitchen's trash disposal zone, pulled out the single chair myself, and sat down quietly in the shadows. I didn't feel small, and I didn't feel humiliated. I had spent decades eating cold sandwiches on the floor of a drafty tractor shed while repairing broken machinery in the middle of a freezing Nebraska night. A restaurant corner was nothing new or frightening to me. I simply folded my calloused hands neatly in my lap and waited, letting them play out the performance they had rehearsed so carefully in their own minds. Not 20 minutes later, the main entrance doors swung wide open again, and Cordelia Thorne made her grand entrance. She swept into the dining room wrapped in an extravagant, floor-length mink coat that must have cost more than a brand-new tractor. She carried herself with her chin held so high her neck looked stiff, her eyes scanning the room like a landlord inspecting a newly acquired tenement property. She didn't walk, she glided across the polished marble, flanked by the kind of heavy, arrogant confidence that only generational wealth and a complete detachment from reality can buy. Cordelia swept straight to the primary VIP table where Thaddeus and Guinevere were waiting, but before she even pulled out her chair to sit, her eyes drifted across the room, catching sight of me sitting alone in the shadows by the kitchen doors. Her carefully sculpted, pencil-thin eyebrows pinched together in a look of profound, undisguised contempt. She didn't bother lowering her voice. She wanted the surrounding tables to hear every single syllable, treating the high-end restaurant as her private theater of social judgment. She turned to her daughter, tilting her head toward my corner with a sharp, dripping sarcasm that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Is that the man who delivers the wholesale root vegetables to the back alley?" Cordelia asked, loudly, cutting cleanly through the ambient chatter of the room. Guinevere let out a soft, high-pitched laugh, artificial, hollow, and entirely devoid of warmth. "No, Mom," Guinevere replied, smoothing the front of her black silk gown with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "That's Thaddeus's mother." Cordelia froze mid-motion, her gloved hand hovering over the back of her chair. The smile vanished instantly from her lips, replaced with a look of stunned disbelief as she stared across the room, letting her gaze crawl over my faded wool coat, my silver-streaked hair, and the dried Nebraska mud caked firmly onto the toes of my heavy work boots. She didn't bother addressing me directly, treating my very presence as something unworthy of dialogue, and instead delivered her final verdict to the table with a cold, condescending growl. "As long as everyone understands precisely where they belong," Cordelia said, her voice dropping into a tone cold enough to freeze water. The words landed with a heavy, deliberate thud, carrying the full, suffocating weight of lifelong class prejudice wrapped in polite, polished cruelty. But as I sat there quietly watching them exchange self-satisfied grins across the vast distance of the dining room, I felt a strange sense of clarity washing over me. They thought they had successfully pushed me out of sight. They had no idea that they were standing right on the edge of a cliff and the ground beneath their feet was about to give way. It was a masterclass in arrogance, a performance built on the fragile assumption that money and status could permanently shield them from reality. Every upward glance, every shared smirk between mother and daughter reinforced the invisible walls they believed kept people like me safely locked away in the margins. But true power is never loud, and real strength doesn't need to announce itself beneath crystal chandeliers. They were so busy looking down at my boots that they completely failed to notice the storm gathering on the horizon. The quiet before the reckoning was almost over, and the ledger was about to be balanced. The low murmur of the surrounding diners seemed to fade away, swallowed by the rising tension that settled like a lead weight over the main VIP table. From my solitary seat in the dark shadows by the kitchen doors, I watched the scene unfold with absolute clarity. The appetizer plates had been cleared away, replaced by crystal wine glasses and silver dessert spoons. But the true appetite at that table had nothing to do with food. It was an appetite for acquisition. Guinevere adjusted her diamond earrings, her posture shifting into something calculated and deliberate. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the starched white tablecloth, with an air of casual entitlement that barely masked her underlying greed. Without any preamble or hesitation, Guinevere steered the conversation straight toward the subject she and her family had clearly been plotting behind closed doors for months: the farmland. With a practiced, honeyed tone designed to sound like innocent family concern, Guinevere brought up the future of my 5,000 acres. She asked Thaddeus, loud enough for the neighboring tables to catch the drift, how the estate would be legally divided and titled once I passed away, justifying her intrusion under the cold banner of long-term financial planning and asset protection. She spoke of my life's work, the dirt, the sweat, the tractor ruts, and the memories of my late husband, as if it were nothing more than a portfolio adjustment waiting to be finalized on a spreadsheet. I didn't wait in the shadows a second longer. I pushed my single wooden chair back, the legs scraping softly against the polished floor, and walked out from the dark corner. I crossed the open expanse of the dining room with steady, measured steps, my heavy work boots leaving faint, dry traces of Nebraska dust across the pristine marble. When I reached the main table, I placed both of my calloused, arthritis-swollen hands flat down on the white tablecloth, leaning in just enough to meet their startled gazes. "Miss Thorne, I am still breathing, and I am still working my land every single day. Being in such a desperate rush to divide my property before I am even in the ground strikes me as rather premature." For a fleeting second, the polished mask slipped, revealing the sudden, ugly shock in Guinevere's eyes. But that shock vanished almost instantly, replaced by a defensive arrogance. Neither she nor her mother felt a single shred of shame or embarrassment at being caught red-handed circling a living woman's inheritance like vultures. Cordelia scoffed openly, tossing her head back with a sharp, derisive laugh that echoed against the crystal chandeliers. She didn't bother lowering her voice as she leaned across the table, throwing caution to the wind and voicing the true intentions they had harbored all along. With absolute disdain, Cordelia loudly declared that once the wedding was safely concluded, they intended to help clean up my mess by forcing the sale of the entire 5,000-acre property at a fire sale price. She stated, without an ounce of tact, that liquidating the farm to pump cash into high-end downtown commercial real estate was the only rational move, mocking the idea of leaving the land in the hands of an aging, stubborn country woman as a pathetic waste of economic potential. They weren't just eyeing my farm, they were actively planning its execution, assuming that my son would simply nod along like a compliant puppet. They had severely miscalculated who was holding the strings. Throughout the entire tirade, Thaddeus sat completely motionless. His face had hardened into something carved from solid glacier ice. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't slam his fist on the table, and he didn't bother arguing with the venomous rhetoric spilling from his future mother-in-law's mouth. Instead, with agonizing slowness, he slid his hand into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon or a plea for mercy. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound legal folder bearing the embossed gold seal of the top corporate law firm in Chicago. With a flick of his wrist, he slid a crisp, multi-page document straight across the smooth linen tablecloth toward Guinevere. "Read it," Thaddeus said simply, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a razor blade. Guinevere paused, her expression souring into deep suspicion. She picked up the document, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon printed across the first page. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a chalky, sickly pale. Her eyes darted frantically across the clauses, reading the ironclad terms explicitly designed by the family's legal team to protect every single square inch of the Vance estate, ensuring that not a single grain of my land or generation of wealth could ever be touched, diluted, or claimed by marriage. The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the explosion. Guinevere's hands began to shake with a mixture of pure humiliation and incandescent rage. All the pristine, high society composure she had practiced for years shattered into a million jagged pieces. Without a word of warning, she snapped a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from the silver desk set beside her, jammed the tip violently against the paper, and began viciously scratching out the protective clauses with thick, black, jagged strokes of ink. She slammed the pen so hard the nib fractured, spraying tiny, dark droplets across the pristine white tablecloth. She lunged forward across the table, her face twisted in fury, her voice rising into a hysterical, screeching shriek that pierced the refined atmosphere of the entire restaurant. "Are you out of your mind, Thaddeus?" she screamed, her voice cracking as she slammed her fist on the table, rattling the crystal glasses. "If we get married, I demand to be put down for 50% of all existing assets, and your mother's worthless farm has to be rolled into our shared marital property immediately." The violent screech of Guinevere's voice echoed off the high vaulted ceiling, making the nearby waiters freeze mid-stride with trays in their hands. Diners at adjacent tables turned their heads, their quiet murmurings instantly cutting off as they stared at the sudden spectacle unfolding at our table. But the jagged shock of her outburst didn't rattle me at all. It only cleared the air, exposing the exact shape of what lived beneath her polished, expensive surface. I decided it was time to give her one final test, a simple mirror held up to the dark corners of her soul, to see what she would do when the illusion of an easy fortune began to crack. I waited for the echoes of her screaming to fade, letting the heavy, suffocating silence settle back over the white cloth table. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I leaned forward, resting my weight on my hands, and let my voice drop into a tone of quiet, manufactured vulnerability. "The truth is," I said, pitching my voice just loud enough to carry across the tense space, "the farm is facing a massive bank debt following last year's terrible drought and ruined harvest. I was planning to ask Thaddeus to step in, use his name as security, and mortgage the remaining parcels of our land just to help me cover what I owe." The moment the words debt and burden hung in the air, the transformation was instantaneous. Guinevere didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. All the carefully rehearsed affection, the coy smiles, and the facade of a devoted fiancée vanished like smoke in a gale. Her face twisted into a mask of pure panic and selfish revulsion. She let go of her broken pen, dropped her hands as if my very existence was suddenly contagious, and grabbed Thaddeus by the sleeve, shaking his arm with frantic desperation. "Did you hear that?" Guinevere shrieked, her voice pitching up in absolute horror as she glared at my son. "She's going to drag you down into financial ruin. You need to draw the line right now, Thaddeus. We are not going to carry the crushing debts of some broke, miserable countrywoman." She stood there panting, chest heaving beneath her designer silk gown, utterly convinced that the threat of ruin would force my son to cast me aside. And right at that exact orchestrated second, fate decided to drop the final curtain. The heavy glass entrance doors swung wide open, and Balthazar Thorne strode into the dining room. He wasn't alone. Flanked by 3 senior corporate partners in immaculate, custom-tailored Italian suits, Balthazar carried himself with the heavy, bloated self-importance of a man whose entire existence depended on a single signature. They were walking straight towards our section, arriving precisely on schedule for the high-stakes signing of a $15 million exclusive distribution contract, a deal his failing, debt-ridden firm desperately needed to stave off bankruptcy. Guinevere spotted her father out of the corner of her eye, and a triumphant, desperate gleam flashed across her face. Seeing her reinforcement arrive, she abandoned all remaining pretense of discretion. She lunged away from the table, practically sprinted to intercept her father and his business partners, and grabbed Balthazar by the arm. Without lowering her voice an inch, she pointed a trembling, manicured finger straight at me across the dining room, exposing us to the most powerful executives in the city before turning back to hurl her final, absolute ultimatum at Thaddeus. "Choose!" Guinevere screamed, her voice cracking with fury as she laid down her ultimate demand for the entire room to witness. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Balthazar stopped dead in his tracks, blinking in sudden confusion, but the moment he recognized me sitting in my frayed coat and then saw the pale, shaking face of his daughter, a slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. He folded his arms across his expensive chest, locking eyes with me as if I were a speck of dust on his polished shoes. Beside him, Cordelia stepped up, joining her husband with matching arrogance. They both stood there, shoulder to shoulder, chin held high, wearing identical grins of supreme victory. They were entirely certain of the outcome. In their small transactional world of wealth and status, a man with a multi-million-dollar career would never choose an aging, mud-booted country mother over a high-society alliance and a $15 million corporate empire. They believed my son was trapped, that he would bow his head, apologize for my presence, and sweep me out through the kitchen doors just to save his own skin. They had no idea who raised him. Thaddeus didn't flinch. He didn't look down, he didn't hesitate, and he didn't glance over at his future father-in-law or the waiting partners holding the multi-million-dollar contract. With agonizing, deliberate slowness, Thaddeus pushed his heavy wooden chair back and stood straight up. The scrape of the chair legs against the marble floor sounded like thunder in the quiet room. He reached down, picked up the thick legal folder from the table, and tucked it securely under his arm. He turned his back completely on Guinevere, ignored the sputtering shock on Balthazar's face, and looked straight into my eyes across the table. His expression was calm, clear, and steady, carrying all the quiet, immovable strength of the soil we came from. "I choose my mother." The violent, chaotic shock of what had just unfolded left the entire dining room paralyzed in a state of absolute, breathless disbelief. Guinevere stumbled backward, her knees buckling beneath her as reality finally shattered her pristine, high-society delusions. She caught herself against the sharp edge of the white-clothed table, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps, her eyes wide and bloodshot with unadulterated panic. Thaddeus didn't move an inch. He stood tall, his expression carved from absolute ice, and gestured with a calm, precise flick of his fingers toward the leather folder still resting on the table right in front of her. "Open it," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy silence. With trembling, bloodless fingers, Guinevere reached down and pulled the thick stack of papers out of the folder. It wasn't a marriage contract or a standard legal addendum. It was a comprehensive 30-day independent investigation report compiled by a premier private intelligence agency hired by the family's legal team. As her eyes frantically scanned the printed pages, every vestige of color drained from her face until she looked like a corpse. The documents laid out everything in excruciating, undeniable detail. Exact copies of text messages, printed email threads, and audio transcriptions of phone calls. Every single word exposed the ugly, calculated truth, how Guinevere had meticulously planned her marriage to Thaddeus as nothing more than a long-term financial acquisition scheme, complete with a structured exit strategy to file for divorce after precisely 3 years to legally plunder half of the Vance family fortune. And printed right there in black and white were her own venomous words, cursing me as a miserable old hag who needs to hurry up and die so we can cash out. Balthazar Thorne's face turned the color of a blank sheet of paper. Panic surging violently through his veins, he snatched the stack of papers directly out of his daughter's shaking hands, his eyes darting across the damning evidence with mounting horror and despair. And right at that exact orchestrated moment, the private dining room's sound system chimed softly, drawing every eye toward the front podium. Clementine, the CEO of the luxury restaurant group and the evening's esteemed guest of honor, walked gracefully up to the small podium near the crystal chandelier. She took the wireless microphone from its stand, her gaze sweeping over the sea of silent, spellbound diners before landing directly on me. When she spoke, her voice carried a sharp emotional resonance that echoed cleanly through every vaulted corner of the hall, ensuring everyone heard every single syllable of the absolute truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clementine began, her voice trembling slightly with profound, suppressed emotion. "The woman whom Miss Thorne just humiliated and insulted as a filthy, uneducated peasant is none other than Martha Vance, the founder and chairwoman of Vance Harvest Group. She is the agricultural titan who owns over 5,000 acres of prime farmland, 12 of the largest processing and export facilities in the entire Midwest. And yes, even the land upon which this five-star restaurant proudly stands was built entirely on property exclusively owned by her." A collective gasp swept through the surrounding tables, instantly breaking the spell. The dining room fell into a dead, suffocating silence so deep you could hear a pin drop on the polished marble floor. Clementine turned away from the breathless crowd, her eyes welling with bright tears as she looked directly across the room at me, her voice softening into a deep, heartfelt tribute that carried decades of hidden history and enduring gratitude. 20 years ago, when my family went bankrupt and stood staring into the absolute abyss of ruin, it was this humble farm woman who quietly stepped forward and paid my university tuition out of her own pocket. She didn't just raise her own son with iron honor and fierce dignity. She quietly funded the futures and educations of countless children from farming families across the valley who had no one else in the world to turn to. The revelation landed with the devastating impact of a physical blow. Balthazar Thorne broke completely under the heavy weight of the absolute truth. All the arrogant bluster, the bloated self-importance, and the corporate armor vanished in a single heartbeat. He lunged forward across the floor, abandoning every last shred of human dignity, and dropped heavily to his knees right in front of me. His hands trembled violently as he clutched at the air, bowing his head over and over in desperate, pathetic supplication, trying to beg for mercy and salvage the $15 million exclusive distribution contract that meant life or death for his failing company. I looked down at him. My expression didn't soften, and my heart didn't waver for even a fraction of a second. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached into the deep pocket of my faded wool coat and pulled an old, scratched fountain pen, the exact pen I had used for 15 years to sign crop delivery orders, banknotes, and lady machinery leases. I pulled the cap off, holding the pen over the open paperwork resting on the table, as if I were actually considering his desperate plea. Balthazar stopped breathing, watching the tip of the pen with hungry, pleading eyes, waiting for a lifeline that would save his collapsing empire from total ruin. I didn't write a single word. I lowered the pen, capped it firmly with a sharp click, and slid it back into my deep pocket. Your company survives by squeezing the life out of working farmers, falsifying trade records, and raising children to mock the sweat and blood of honest people. With those final words, I turned my back on him. The multi-million-dollar contract was permanently erased, and the grand, fragile empire of the Thorne family collapsed into dust right before their eyes. The low murmurs, whispering voices, and pointed stares of the surrounding diners followed the disgraced Thorne family every single step of the way as they slowly slunk out of the private dining room, completely defeated, their high society armor shattered into absolute dust. As the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, the restless, tense energy in the hall gradually settled back into a quiet, respectful calm. Thaddeus didn't stay in his previous seat across the long table. Instead, he quietly stood up, walked around, and sat down in the empty chair right beside me, the very same seat that Guinevere had sneered at and aggressively refused to touch just an hour earlier. He reached across the starched white tablecloth, gently taking my calloused, arthritis-swollen hand into his large palms, holding it tight as a single, heavy tear broke free and traced a slow path down his rugged cheek. "I'm sorry, Mom," Thaddeus whispered, his voice cracking with a lifetime of pent-up emotion and regret. "I am so sorry I let you endure all that humiliation tonight just to prove a lesson." I reached out with my other hand, resting it softly on his broad shoulder, and gave him a gentle, reassuring shake of my head. "You have nothing to apologize for because of your good intentions, son. Just promise me one thing. From now on, never let anyone make you prove their character by letting them trample on the roots and the soil that raised you." The next morning, the sun rose over a clean slate and a brand new purpose that breathed life back into the entire valley. Every single penny that had been aggressively earmarked for that obscene multi-million-dollar high society wedding celebration was immediately rerouted by us. Thaddeus and I sat down with our legal team at the kitchen table and signed the final papers, officially transforming the entire extravagant wedding budget into the newly established Martha Vance Scholarship Fund, a permanent financial endowment dedicated to covering full university tuition for the hardworking children of struggling local farming families throughout the region who needed a helping hand to get ahead. And to lead it, Clementine officially stepped in, accepting the role of executive director, with tears of deep gratitude shining in her eyes, vowing to dedicate her entire life to paying forward the exact same kindness that had once saved her family from the abyss. Every single corner of the county felt a little lighter, knowing that the wealth extracted by corporate greed was now returning directly to the soil that produced it. Neighbors and local farmers who had struggled through years of dry spells, mounting debts, and unfair market conditions suddenly found a beacon of hope in the new scholarship foundation. It wasn't just about paying tuition. It was about telling every kid in the valley that their sweat, their dignity, and their future mattered just as much as the silver spoon heirs sitting in downtown high-rises. Education became the true equalizer, quietly changing destinies, one hardworking family at a time, without asking for applause or recognition from the elite. Months rolled by, and the seasons turned, painting the valley in rich shades of amber and gold. The memory of that dreadful night in the city faded into a distant shadow, replaced instead by the steady, beautiful hum of progress. Every single semester, hundreds of young men and women, kids who previously had to choose between dropping out of school and watching their parents lose their family land, received their acceptance letters and full financial support certificates bearing the seal of the foundation. They walked onto college campuses with their heads held high, carrying the quiet dignity of the soil in their veins. Clementine poured every ounce of her boundless energy into managing the daily operations, turning the charity into a beacon of absolute transparency and fierce support. And back on the farm, the work never stopped. When the annual Harvest Festival arrived, the entire community gathered not around a sterile corporate banquet table, but right here on the open fields, sharing homemade bread, laughter, and stories under the wide evening sky. By dawn 2 days later, I had left the noise, chaos, and flashing neon lights of the city far behind me, returning entirely to the tranquil, grounding embrace of my old wooden farmhouse. I pulled on my worn, faded wool coat, slipped back into my trusty, mud-cucked work boots, and stepped out onto the open wooden porch just as the clock struck 4 in the morning. The cool, pre-dawn air bit gently at my cheeks as I walked out into the vast, endless sea of golden wheat, running my calloused hand lightly across the heavy, ripe stalks, swaying softly in the dark morning breeze. The wind whispered steadily through the quiet fields, carrying the rich, familiar scent of damp earth and honest, back-breaking labor that no amount of dirty corporate wealth could ever replicate. Money can buy you a seat at the most expensive table in the city, and it can buy a glittering diamond to blind the eyes of fools, but it can never, under any circumstance, buy you a true soul. It can never purchase your roots, your human decency, or the quiet, enduring grace of an honest heart.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.